The air carried the sharp tang of limestone dust, the workshop stone walls echoing with the steady tap-tap of my chisel. I shaped a block of granite, its surface yielding to patterns my grandfather taught me, each strike a link to his legacy. This was Clay's Masonry in Asheville, North Carolina, a shop he'd built in 1910, where I'd learned to carve strength from stone. At 62, my hands were rough, my shoulder ached from last month's surgery, but my resolve was solid, anchored to this craft. That anchor was cracking, not from age, but from a betrayal that hit harder than any mallet. The letter came on a crisp Tuesday, its words slicing through the workshop's hum of grinders. A developer from Raleigh claimed Clay's Masonry had been sold for $2 million, my signature on the contract. My grip tightened on the chisel, dust settling on my boots, the stone cold under my palm. I hadn't signed anything. The ache in my shoulder flared, a reminder of the surgery that had kept me from the shop for weeks, but my mind was sharp. No haze of meds, no lapse to excuse this. I called the lawyer, demanded the contract. When it arrived by email, my name was there, etched in a scrawl I didn't recognize, a betrayal heavier than any slab I'd carved. I'm Howard Clay, mason by trade, father by heart, fool by trust, if you ask my apprentice, Neil. He's 30, a sharp-eyed craftsman who joined the shop 3 years ago to modernize our brand. I'd trusted him, let him handle the books, even when my son, Nathan, warned Neil was distracted by his own construction startup. I'd sunk $120,000 into roof repairs after a storm in 20, and the shop scraped by, earning $60,000 a year. Nathan, 35, an architect, and his wife, Lena, had pushed me to sell, saying I was too old to lift stone, too stubborn to rest. I'd brushed them off, carving fireplaces, preserving my grandfather's craft. But Neil's lie was a fracture I couldn't ignore alone. I drove to Neil's office across Asheville, the city's streets lined with oaks, its breweries glowing through the morning mist. He met me at the door, his tablet open, his grin tight. "Howard, it's done," he said, his voice slick, like he was pitching a client. "You signed after your surgery. The shop's outdated. Condos are Asheville's future." I held up the contract, my voice low, the ache in my shoulder grounding me. "This isn't my signature, Neil." He shrugged, his eyes flicking to his screen. "You were recovering. I acted for you." I left, the mountain air cold on my face, his words a crack I couldn't let spread. Back at the workshop, the grinders were silent, the air thick with the scent of slate and sawdust. I'd given Neil everything, access to the ledgers, my grandfather's pattern books, my trust. I'd covered his errors, $8,000 for a botched website, $6,000 for a delayed shipment, thinking mentorship meant loyalty. He'd repaid me with a lie that could bury the shop, my purpose, the only place where my chisel felt true. Nathan called that night, his voice heavy with concern. "Dad, take the money. You're not young anymore." I hung up, my hands shaking, their doubt heavier than the granite blocks in my yard. But Neil's lie wasn't flawless. I needed proof, something harder than my word against his polish. I started in the shop's archive, a dusty loft where I'd stored my grandfather's things after he passed in '79. The air was stale, the oak chest creaking as I opened it. Inside were his sketchbooks, their pages yellowed, filled with drawings of arches and notes on mortar mixes. One page stopped me, a deed from 1910, naming the shop a historical landmark, with a clause barring sales without the heir's consent. My breath caught, the paper fragile but firm. It wasn't enough, but it was a cornerstone, a foundation to brace me against Neil's deception. I called Roy Tanner, my friend and a carpenter whose workshop shared Asheville's arts district. We met at his studio, its walls lined with cedar planks, the air rich with turpentine and coffee. Roy, 59, his beard flecked with sawdust, poured me a mug, its steam curling in the morning chill. "Neil's been flashy," he said, his voice gruff. "New truck, big trips, where's the cash from?" I showed him the deed, the forged contract. "He's hiding something," Roy said, setting his mug down hard. "Let's carve it out." His trust was a spark, rekindling the mason in me, the man who'd built truth from stone. We went to the shop's office, a cramped room smelling of grit and old ink, where Neil had kept the books. I hadn't checked them since my surgery, trusting him to manage. The computer was locked, but Roy knew a tech, Mara, an arts blogger who'd built his website. She met us at dusk, her laptop glowing, the mountain breeze soft outside. Mara cracked the password in 15 minutes, her smirk sharp. "Your apprentice is careless," she said, pulling up Neil's emails. There it was, messages to the developer, Neil admitting he'd forged my signature for $200,000 to clear my debts. My chest tightened, not just at the betrayal, but at how I'd missed the cracks in his facade. Roy pushed harder. He took me to the Asheville Historical Society, its library a maze of leather-bound records, where a curator, Amos, knew my grandfather's stonework from a 50s bridge project. Amos unearthed the shop's file, confirming its landmark status, a protection that voided any sale without my approval. The forged contract was rubble, a flawed block ready to crumble. Amos handed me the report, his eyes kind. "Your grandfather's work built this city, Howard," he said, and I felt it, the shop's legacy, my legacy, stronger than Neil's greed. I needed Nathan to see it, not Neil's story. He met me at the workshop, the air heavy with dust, the granite slabs a silent jury. I spread the evidence on a workbench, the deed, Neil's emails, the society's report. "He lied, Nathan," I said, my voice steady, the Masons focus back. Nathan looked away, his hands clenching his phone. "I knew his startup was failing," he admitted, his voice low. "I thought the sale would save you stress." The confession cut, not because it was new, but because it was his. "Stand with me," I said, and he nodded, his eyes meeting mine, a son I'd almost lost to doubt. Neil's words echoed, the shop's outdated, louder than the grinders in the yard. I'd let him into my world, shared my grandfather's carving techniques, only to watch him trade them for glass towers and profit. But the Asheville Artisan Fair was in 10 days, a chance to show the truth, not just to Nathan, but to the city, to the community that had admired my fireplaces, trusted my walls. I needed more than emails and deeds. I needed Asheville to see Neil's fault lines, not just one crack in his tale. Roy delivered again, meeting me at the shop with a ledger he'd found in a shared supplier shed, his hands dusted with sawdust. We worked late, the mountain wind howling outside, tracing the shop's finances. Neil had siphoned $80,000 over 2 years, small sums marked marketing that funded his startup. A bank statement, buried in his cloud drive, showed his debt, $250,000, tied to a failing app, his ambitions crumbling faster than mine. Each piece, deed, emails, ledger, statement, was a stone in the wall I was building, not just for me, but for Nathan, for the grandfather who'd taught me to carve permanence. I went to the Arts District next, a network of potters, weavers, and smiths who'd known my grandfather's work. We met at a brewery, its tables warm with candlelight, the air rich with hops and resolve. I shared Neil's lie, showed the deed, the emails. "This isn't just my shop," I said, my voice steady over the clink of glasses. "It's our craft." They nodded, their commitment a spark. Clara, a potter, Eli, a smith, Mara, now my tech ally. They vowed to rally the fair's crowd, to stand with me when I faced Neil. "You're not alone, Howard," Roy said, his hand on my shoulder, warm with trust. The days before the fair were like laying a foundation. Every move had to be exact, every stone true. I couldn't shake Nathan's confession, his worry, his belief that I was too old to fight. I'd let him down once, trusting Neil with the books, letting his ambition chip away at my vision like a poorly struck chisel. I'd carved a mantle for his wedding, taught Lena to polish stone, but I'd let them see me as worn, not a mason. Not now. Neil's betrayal wasn't just about the shop. It was about the years he'd overshadowed, the trust he'd fractured, the father he'd dismissed as past his prime. Roy wasn't just a carpenter. He was a brother I'd chosen. He showed up at the shop with a USB drive, his grin fierce under his rain-damp cap. "Mara's been digging," he said, plugging it into the computer, the screen glowing with more of Neil's emails. Dozens, spanning 2 years, detailing his plan to sell the shop, $300,000 total promise to creditors. One, to his investor, was stark. "Howard's finished. The contract's locked." My gut twisted, not for Neil, but for the man I'd been, open, guiding, thinking apprenticeship meant family. Roy handed me a beer, its chill steadying me. "You're tougher than his lies," he said, and I believed him, because I felt it, the workshop's pulse, my grandfather's voice, still shaping me. I went back to Nathan, needing his strength, not his fear. He met me at the shop, the air thick with the scent of cut stone, the slabs a silent witness. I showed him the new emails, the bank statement, the ledger. "This is who Neil is," I said, my voice low, the mason's patience thinning. Nathan's face fell, his hands tracing the deed's edges. "I should have trusted you," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought he'd protect you." The admission was a weight, not just his, but ours, a family dulled by distance. "Stand with me at the fair," I said, and he nodded, his grip on my arm a promise, a son I hadn't lost. Neil texted the next day, his tone sharp, demanding I drop this foolishness. I met him at a cafe, its walls warm with exposed brick, the air thick with espresso and cedar. He sat across me, his fingers tapping his tablet, his eyes cold. "You're embarrassing yourself, Howard," he said, when I mentioned the emails, the deed. "The shop's sold. Move on." I slid a copy of the Society's report across, my voice calm, the mason's precision my shield. "This is legacy, Neil. My legacy. You can't bury it." He smirked, but his hands shook, his confidence a chipped stone. "Prove it," he said, leaving, his boots loud on the wood floor. I nodded, his challenge heavier than any block I'd carved. I needed one more piece, something to anchor Neil's lies to the city's trust. I went to Esther Holt, a weaver I'd traded tools with in the 80s, now retired but owed a favor for a granite slab I'd shaped for her loom. Her home smelled of wool and wax, her hands warm as she clasped mine. "Heard about the condos," she said, her voice firm but kind. "Neil's been promising jobs that don't exist." She had proof, texts from Neil, offering consulting fees to silent suppliers, $20,000 total siphoned from the shop. "Break him, Howard," Esther said, handing me a folder, its pages heavy with truth. The community was stirring, like Asheville's mountains after a thaw. Amos spread word at the Historical Society, his colleagues drafting a letter to the City Council demanding a sale review. Roy's Arts District allies, Clara, Eli, others, started a petition, 300 signatures calling for the shop's protection. Esther called her old weaving circle, women I'd learned from, who promised to pack the fair stage. "This is bigger than you, Howard," Roy said, meeting me at the cafe again, his coffee cold, his eyes warm. "This is us." I believed him, not because I hoped, but because I saw it, the fair's promise, the stone I'd carved, the people who'd trusted my craft. I stood in the workshop one night, its stone walls cool under the stars, the sign, Clay's masonry, fading but proud. I stood there, the wind soft, remembering the summers I'd spent with my grandfather, his hands guiding mine, his voice promising I'd carry his work. I'd given Neil $120,000 in trust, my grandfather's legacy, my heart, and he'd carved a lie that could have buried it all. But Asheville was rising, like granite before a strike. The fair was in 3 days. Neil thought he'd won, but he didn't know my stone, my strength, the community that had rooted itself around me. The workshop was a forge now, the office buried under evidence, sketchbooks, emails, ledgers, bank statements, Esther's texts, Amos's report. I carved a new block, not for me, but for the fair, a keystone, its pattern a blend of my grandfather's drawings, every line a mark in the case I was building. Nathan helped, his hands careful but eager, polishing edges as we worked late, the wind sighing outside. "You're incredible at this," he said, his eyes on the stone, not me, but his words were a spark I hadn't known I needed. Roy stopped by, his USB drive updated, his grin fierce. "Neil's out of stone," he said, and I believed him, because I'd built this truth like a wall, every block locked tight. The night before the Asheville Artisan Fair, I couldn't sleep, the workshop's stone walls heavy with memory. I traced the keystone I'd carved, its pattern a blend of my grandfather's sketches, its edges sharp under my fingers. I saw the mason I'd been, the one I was again, standing where my grandfather had, his chisel my guide. Nathan met me at dawn, his truck idling outside, his face tired but firm. "I'm with you, Dad," he said, holding a folder, his own notes, supplier statements, ready to stand by me. Roy arrived with Clara, Eli, and Mara, their arms full of flyers, the petition now 600 signatures strong. Esther brought her weaving circle, 12 women in homespun scarves, their eyes fierce. "This is your fare, Howard," Roy said, his hand on my shoulder, the weight of trust I'd forgotten. The Asheville Artisan Fair was alive, its stalls bright with pottery and ironwork, the air thick with cedar smoke and bluegrass, the Blue Ridge Mountains a rugged backdrop. Neil stood on the main stage, his jacket crisp, his smile polished, pitching the condo project as Asheville's future. I sat in the front row, my evidence in a binder, Nathan at my side, his hand steady on mine. Roy, Clara, Eli, Mara, Esther's circle, the suppliers, they filled the crowd, their eyes on me, not Neil. The fair director, a man who'd bought my stonework for years, called me up. I stood, my shoulder aching but my back straight, the mason I'd always been. "Neil Vance lied," I said, my voice clear, the crowd silent. I laid out the evidence, my grandfather's sketchbooks, projected on a screen, their patterns against Neil's forgery, emails, his own words damning him, $300,000 stolen, the society's report, ignored, ledgers, bank statements, Esther's texts, the petition I'd built, every lie a cracked stone. Nathan stood, his voice steady, admitting his doubt, his regret. Roy testified, his voice fierce, detailing Neil's pattern. Esther's circle nodded, their presence a foundation Neil couldn't shake. Neil faltered, his smile gone, his excuses, misunderstandings, Howard's age, lost in the crowd's murmurs, the director's scowl. The director called a vote. The sale was voided, the shop protected, Neil's deal shattered. The crowd roared, Clara's voice loudest, Nathan's hand squeezing mine, his eyes wet but proud. "I see you, Dad," he whispered, and I felt Asheville shift, my name no longer outdated but a cornerstone. Neil left, his head low, his ambition crumbled like flawed marble. The city council reaffirmed the shop's status a month later, Amos's letter and the petition, now 800 signatures, sealing the deal. I relaunched Clay's Masonry as a re-artisan center, small but ours, with Roy as partner, Nathan as designer, Clara and Eli teaching classes. We broke ground on a community workshop, my grandfather's patterns reborn, their lines catching the spring sun. Esther came to the opening, her smile warm, her scarf woven with a motif from my grandfather's arches. The Artisan Center, named Clay's Stone, opened a year later, its ribbon cut by Nathan, his speech naming me, not Neil, as the mason who stood firm. The workshop hummed again, its air alive with new craftsmen, their hands learning techniques I'd carried for decades. The mountains loomed outside, their ridges steady, the city's pulse mine again. Nathan worked beside me, his blueprints sparking interest from builders in Raleigh, his laughter a spark I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "You built this, Dad," he said one evening, the sunset painting the stone walls gold. I nodded, not because I needed his words, but because they were true. Neil's startup collapsed under the weight of his debts, his $300,000 chased by creditors and a fraud investigation. But he came to the center 6 months later, his jacket gone, his eyes red but earnest. "I was wrong," he said, his voice small, standing by the granite slabs where I'd taught him to carve at 27. I didn't forgive him fully, but I handed him a chisel, its handle worn. "Start here," I said, and he nodded, his hands trembling as he shaped a block, a novice again. I saw my grandfather in him, not the lie, but the chance to rebuild, a stone I'd learned to offer. The community grew stronger, like Asheville's rivers after a rain. Roy's carpentry shaped new studios, Clara's pottery sold at fairs, Eli's ironwork graced homes. Amos organized a showcase of my grandfather's sketchbooks, drawing crowds from Charlotte. Esther's weaving circle mentored young artisans, their looms bright with my stone-inspired patterns. The petition, now a framed document on the center's wall, grew to 1,000 signatures, a testament to a city that had chosen craft over concrete. "You gave us back our roots," Mara said at a fair, her blog now boosting the center's reach, her grin as wide as the mountain sky. I stood in the workshop one morning, a year after the opening, the grinders quiet, a new keystone finished, gray and gold, a design my grandfather had drawn but never carved. I thought of the $120,000 I'd lost to trust, the years I'd spent doubting my strength, the silence I'd let dim my family. I'd built through it, not just for me, but for Nathan, for Roy, for the craftsmen who'd come after. The center wasn't just a shop, it was a monument, a mosaic of hands and hearts, stronger than any lie Neil could have chiseled. I visited my grandfather's grave that afternoon, the cemetery lush with pines, the air sharp with moss. I laid a stone chip on his marker, its grain catching the light, a thank you for the craft he'd planted in me. I'd carried his name, not because I had to, but because I could. Back at the center, I taught a class, my hands guiding a young mason's, her eyes bright with the same fire I'd felt at 12. Nathan watched, his smile soft, Lena beside him, her hands dusted with clay from her latest lesson. "You're still teaching us," Lena said, and I laughed, the sound lighter than I'd known in years. The YouTube camera waited, its lens a window to the 50-plus souls who'd lost something to lies, who'd doubted their own strength. I spoke, my voice steady, the mountains hummed soft outside. I carved my way back, not because I had to, but because I could. What stone would you shape to prove your truth?